Mark, you've been part of the media, you've covered many different politicians over the years. Have you seen this kind of extreme reaction to trying to control coverage from any other administration or any other politician?
Well, one thing that should be noted is that, I was deeply involved in coverage of the Iraq War when I was at the Chicago Tribune. I was editing those stories every night. And to a large extent, the news media went along with what the Bush administration was doing. I mean, the Bush administration didn't have to be furious about the news coverage because the news coverage was largely compliant. And part of that was maybe a little bit more kind of gullibility on the part of the news media then. I mean, the idea that they won't lie to us about weapons of mass destruction, and so there was that gullibility, but also the Bush administration sold the war. I mean, over a period of months, they didn't do what the Trump people did, which is just say, hey, we feel like going to war, so we're going to go to war. We're not going to talk to Congress. We're not going to talk to the American people. We're just going to do it. And obviously, when you do that, and the war, it was polling terribly even before that. When they started beating the war drums, the American people clearly aren't in favor of it. And so I think that set up the news media to be skeptical of it. And frankly, I've been very disappointed with media coverage overall, major media coverage over the last decade. It's been really normalizing Trump and trying to kind of paper over the really embarrassing things that he's done, and it just frankly his mentally unhinged behavior. And so I've been sharply critical of the news media, but in this case, Trump set it up himself for the news media to be very skeptical. I mean, by not selling the war and just going in and taking, in a really reckless way. And so I guess I must say that I've been very encouraged by the news coverage so far. And it's been a departure for me to not be complaining about terrible news coverage, because I think we're getting a lot of good news coverage on things, the girls' school airstrike, for example, in Iran. You had Trump outrageously try to suggest that the Iranians blew up their own schoolgirls, but the news media wasn't buying it. I mean, nobody's buying it. And it was just gratifying to see the news media, look at video and look at other, hard evidence to try to, ferret out what exactly happened there. And it all points to the U.S.
We've seen that the news media has not been as critical, to your point with your piece on the media giving Trump a pass largely on his mental and physical health issues.
Right.
Also, not asking him a lot of questions about the Epstein scandal, even though his name appears at least hundreds of thousands of times in the documents that have been released. Why do you think the media has taken a more critical eye to the war? I'm wondering if perhaps one of the turning points was what we saw from his Department of Homeland Security in Minneapolis, where they were telling us not to believe our lying eyes, not to believe the video of the killing of 2 U.S. citizens that really, took a whack at their credibility.
Right. Well, I mean, one of the things I've really criticized the media for doing is blowing up Trump's lies over and over and over again. But then when he issues a new lie, pretending that he just might be telling the truth this one time, this idea that this lack of a learning curve by the mainstream media where, we know he's a liar and that he lies all the time, especially about important things, but even about crazy stuff. Like the other day, he claimed that he had predicted 9/11. Well, he didn't. That's been debunked. There's a lot of stuff like that. I mean, he just goes to crazy town all the time. So I just feel like there's been a lack of skepticism. But here, you're right. I do think you're right. I think Minneapolis did really change some hearts and minds in the news media, where they recognized that it was a Trump regime policy to systematically lie about things like that. That's their policy. They lie immediately. The Homeland Security, you can just count on lying when something bad happens with them and the American public.
You've been very critical of the mainstream media for normalizing Trump and his lies, uh, and for embracing both sides reporting, where the Trump administration, Trump as a candidate would lie, they would present the facts, but you figured out yourself. Even
Right,
though the the role of the media, as we know, should be to present facts and
right,
truth.
right.
How much responsibility do you feel that the media has for the fact that Trump has been able to be not just elected once, but twice, and in spite of telling thousands upon thousands of demonstrably, false
Right,
things?
right. I think that a great responsibility. I mean, there are two different things. You've got the propaganda media like Fox News, who they feel it's their job to help Trump lie. But then you have mainstream media, New York Times, the networks, and what they've done is just what I said. They've done the whole. He lied to us, 3,000 times in the last few months, but we're going to pretend this time he might be telling the truth. And so, I mean, I've always said that you have to really be skeptical of headlines that start out Trump says, because what in effect what they do a lot of times is just say what Trump says and just leave it at that in the headline, which is what most people read is the headline. And so he gets his message across, even though if they framed it right, if they said, in effect, this guy who's lied to us about the war, a bunch of times just said something about the war, if they framed it in that way, that this is a person who is not trustworthy, then
Mhm.
they would be doing much more of a service. And not, I'm not saying a service to the Democrats or a service to the resistance. I'm talking about a service to the truth. And so I think and that's their job. I mean, the news media is supposed to be in the truth business and the facts business. And so when they just when they amplify things that are false that he says and act like that's just normal and that's what presidents do, they're not serving the people. Susan, one of the things that there are two different things. There's one when Trump lies about the policies and lies about the horrible things he's doing. But there's another thing about when the news media tolerate him being mentally unstable and act like that's normal, or what they do, even if I mean, let's think about this guy. The last No King's March, this guy posted a video of him flying an airplane and dropping excrement on protesters. I mean, that's outrageously crazy. That's insane behavior. Yet the New York Times wouldn't even call it excrement. They didn't call it shit. They called it brown liquid. They were that scared of Trump that they had to call it brown liquid. And they didn't even say that he dropped anything on protesters in the main headline. They just said he flew an airplane. So there was this kind of timidity
Mhm.
with the Trump administration that, in effect, some people call it sane washing, but they basically underplayed just how insane he was. This guy also, let's remember when Rob Reiner was murdered, the Trump posted that it was Rob Reiner's fault that he was murdered. That he was
Right,
murdered because he made people angry. And I mean, that is just plain unhinged behavior.
right,
No person in public life, not to even mention a president, should be tolerated doing that kind of thing. Yet it became this. It was this one day story. It was one off, and it just rolled down the river, and then there was something new to talk about. This is what the news media is not doing right. They need to write what I call umbrella stories, which is when you take everything, all the crazy stuff, and you put it right under the umbrella and you write a sweeping story that explains what the overall picture is based on all these data points.
mhm,
And that way you can write a really clear headline: Trump showing signs of mental instability. I mean, not that they would ever do that because they're afraid to, unfortunately, but write a really direct headline that is a sweeping picture of what's going on, and then just lay out all the data points. Instead, if you write these little one-offs about all the crazy little things he does, it just kind of fades into the background too fast.